Most people accept it as normal that we are born, and we don't remember before. Yet if you sit with it for a moment, it's one of the strangest facts of human life, because you arrive here with no clear memory of where you came from, why you came, what you were before your name, and what the world looked like from the other side of birth. And still you're expected to live as if forgetting is simply the default setting. And what you were never told is that many mystical traditions didn't treat this forgetting as an accident, because they treated it as part of the structure of the world, almost like a veil that drops the moment you enter the body, not necessarily to punish you, but to shape the you're going to have here, for better or for worse. To keep this simple, imagine you're about to play a game that only works if you don't remember the full map. Because if you remembered everything, you would walk straight to the ending, and the whole point of the journey would disappear. And in that metaphor, forgetting is what makes the game feel real, what makes choices feel heavy, what makes love and fear feel intense, and what makes your identity feel like it's truly you, even if it's just one layer of you. Now, the Gnostic view takes that metaphor and makes it sharper, because it suggests the world isn't only a classroom, it can also act like a system that keeps souls cycling, and the simplest version of their idea is that forgetting is not just a side effect of becoming human, it's one of the main tools that keeps the soul from recognizing its origin, since a soul that remembers too much becomes harder to control, harder to distract, and harder to trick into living only for survival, status, and approval. So, in this video, we're going to explore the question carefully, without turning it into a scary story, and without pretending we can prove invisible things like a lab experiment, because the goal is understanding, meaning we'll look at 3 layers that explain why forgetting might happen: the natural layer of the brain and childhood, development, the psychological layer of identity and survival, and the mystical layer that ancient traditions described as a veil, a fog, or an engineered distraction. And if you're here because you've felt that strange sense that you're more than your biography, more than your job, more than your worries, and you want to understand these ideas without hype, then subscribe to the channel, because we build these maps slowly and clearly. And this is the kind of topic that becomes powerful only when you connect the pieces over time. To start, we need one essential distinction that will keep everything grounded. There is a difference between memory as a brain function, like storing events, and memory as a deeper recognition, like knowing who you are beneath the story you've been handed. Because once you separate those two kinds of remembering, the mystery becomes much easier to explore. The first layer of the answer is the simplest one, because even if you don't believe in anything mystical, the human brain alone already explains a big part of why we don't remember. False explains why we barely remember our earliest years, since memory isn't just a camera that records everything. It's a system that grows, organizes, and filters, and early on that system is still under construction. When a baby is born, the brain is not finished, and the parts that help you form stable, story-like memories, the kind you can later replay and describe, develop gradually, which means the first period of life is more like raw experience than like organized autobiography. And even when strong experiences happen, they may not be stored in the neat timeline format that an older mind can retrieve easily. And there's another simple piece: language shapes memory, because once you have words, you can label things. And once you can label things, you can store them as concepts. And once you can store them as concepts, you can recall them later. So before language fully settles in, many experiences remain more like sensations and emotional impressions than like a clear narrative you can retell. So at the biological level, forgetting isn't a strange glitch. It's part of how a developing human mind becomes functional, since the brain is prioritizing survival skills, bonding, and learning patterns, not building a perfect archive of everything that happened. But here's where it gets interesting, because even later, when the brain can form strong memories, it still doesn't record life in a neutral way, because memory is selective, and the selection has a purpose. It builds osity. Only remember what happened. You remember what supports the story of me. And the more you identify with a story, the more your mind filters reality to fit it. That means forgetting is not just missing data, it's also a kind of editing, and the editor is survival, because your mind is always asking, what do I need to focus on to stay safe, to belong, and to predict what comes next? And anything outside that survival sent focus often fades, even if it might be spiritually important. This is the bridge to the second layer, because once you understand that the mind edits experience to protect identity, you can see why a soul, if it exists beyond the mind, might appear forgotten the moment it enters the body, since the body brings you into a world of hunger, danger, social rules, and constant signals, and those signals train your attention to lock onto what is urgent, not what is eternal. So the brain layer gives you a grounded base, but it also points toward a question of identity is built through focus, and focus is shaped by survival. Then forgetting might be more than a missing file. It might be the cost of becoming a person inside a demanding world. And now we can step into the psychological layer, where we explore how the soul's forgetting could be explained as the mind narrowing awareness into a usable identity, almost like putting on a suit that helps you function here, but also hides what you were before you put it on. The psychological layer of forgetting is easier to understand if you imagine identity as a kind of narrowing, because to function in a world this loud, your mind can't hold infinity in its hands. It has to choose a smaller shape, a story that fits into daily life. And that story becomes me. When you're born, you don't arrive as a finished personality with clear boundaries. You rear vaza, bundle of sensation, needs, and raw awareness. And then, little by little, the world teaches you what matters here through reward, punishment, attention, rejection, and repetition, until your mind learns patterns like, this is safe, this is dangerous, this gets love, this gets shame, and out of those patterns a self-image forms. And that self-image is useful, because without it you wouldn't know how to play the game of being human. You wouldn't know how to communicate, how to predict people, how to protect your body, how to plan, and how to hold relationships together. So the small self is not a mistake, it's a tool. Problem is that the tool can become a prison when it believes it is the whole person, because once your identity locks in, your attention begins to serve it, meaning you look for proof that you are who you think you are. You chase experiences that support your story, and you avoid experiences that threaten it. And over time, everything that doesn't fit the identity fades into the background. That is why forgetting can feel like a veil, because the veil isn't necessarily a wall outside you. It's the mind's constant habit of narrowing, editing, and selecting. And the selection is guided by survival, belonging, and domeki. This simple. Think of a child who learns early, that being quiet or approval, or that being funny earns safety, or that being perfect avoids punishment. And the child doesn't just learn a behavior. The child begins to build a self around it, and the deeper parts of the child, the fear, the tenderness, the wild curiosity, the sense of mystery, often get pushed down, not because they're unreal, but because they don't fit the survival strategy. So, if there is something like a soul, something deeper than personality, then entering a human life could feel like putting on a mask that helps you survive. And after years of wearing it, you stop noticing it's a mask, because everyone around you is wearing masks too, and the world rewards the masks, not the depth behind them. And this is where ancient mystical traditions start sounding surprisingly modern, because they often describe spiritual work as remembering, not remembering like recalling a childhood birthday, but remembering like recognizing what you are beneath the survival costume. And they say the main obstacle to that remembering is not ignorance of facts, it's identification, the habit of believing you are only the mask. So in psychological terms, the soul forgets because the mind becomes busy building a functioning self, and a functioning self tends to reduce awareness into something manageable, since constant expanded awareness would make ordinary life almost impossible, because you'd feel too much, notice too much, and be less willing to accept the small games people play. Now we're ready for the mystical layer, where Gnostic traditions take this narrowing process and say, yes, there's a natural brain reason. Yes, there's a psychological identity reason, but there's also a system-level reason, a structure that benefits when souls forget, because forgetting keeps the cycle running and keeps the spark from recognizing its origin in the mystical layer, especially in nostal, cosmology, zolesi forgetis, not treated as a random side effect because it's described as something the world almost depends on, like a rule built into the environment, since a soul that arrives fully remembering would question everything immediately, and questioning is exactly what breaks systems that run on habit and obedience. In that worldview, the material world is not just nature, it's a managed space, a place with rulers, patterns, and pressures, and the easiest way to imagine it without getting lost in names is to think of it like a city that never sleeps, where lights are always flashing, messages are always shouting, and every street corner offers a new distraction, because if the city keeps you busy enough, you never walk far enough to notice the walls around it. So, forgetting is described like a veil that drops at birth, not necessarily as a magical curtain you can point to, but as a combination of forces that pull attention downward into survival, emotion, and identity, until the deeper spark of awareness stops looking upward and starts believing the city is the whole universe. Gnostic texts often talk about archons, and we don't need to picture them as monsters to understand the idea, because they function like gatekeepers of the system, patterns of control that keep the lower world stable. And what keeps people stable, in the sense of predictable, is not deep truth, it's fear, guilt, pride, craving, and constant comparison, since those emotions keep the mind reactive, and a reactive mind rarely remembers anything beyond the next problem. That's why, in this frame, the soul forgets for a reason that is both simple and unsettling. Remembering would make you harder to steer, because if you remembered your origin as something higher, you would stop treating the system's rewards and punishments as ultimate reality. And once that happens, the system loses its grip. To make this feel clear, imagine a worker who forgets they have options, forgets they have value, forgets they can leave a job that is exploiting them, because as long as the worker forgets, the job can keep extracting energy. Yet the moment the worker remembers, the job doesn't have the same power, because the worker's sense of identity expands beyond the workplace. In the same way, the Gnostic story suggests that the world keeps souls employed in cycles of worry, ambition, shame, and desire, and forgetting is what keeps the contract signed, since a soul that doesn't remember will chase the system's prizes, fear the system's threats, and rarely stop long enough to ask who benefits from. And if that sounds too dark, here's the balanced version. The myth isn't only blaming an external villain, it's also describing how control works in any environment, because environments shape attention, and attention shapes identity, and identity shapes what you remember. So even if you treat the archons as symbols, the symbol still points to a real mechanism, which is that a noisy world trains forgetfulness by training constant reaction. And this is where the topic becomes practical, because it means remembering is not about forcing memories of past lives. It's about weakening the veil in daily life, meaning noticing what steals your attention, noticing what triggers you into automatic behavior, and slowly building the ability to pause, to observe, and to reconnect with the quieter awareness beneath the survival noise. And if this is landing for you, and you want more explanations that keep the mystery understale, take a sequence, like the video, because it helps this kind of grounded, non-sensational spiritual content reach people who are looking for clarity instead of hype. Now we can go deeper into the heart of the question. If forgetting happens through these layers, brain, identity, and system pressure, then what exactly is the veil? How do traditions describe it? And what are the most common ways the veil shows up inside ordinary life without you noticing? If the soul forgets at birth, the veil is the name many traditions give to the mechanism behind that forgetting, and the easiest way to understand it is not as a literal curtain floating in space, but as a set of pressures that make your awareness shrink until you identify with a small version of yourself and call it the whole truth. In plain language, the veil is what happens when your attention gets captured so completely by the demands of life that you stop noticing the deeper part of you that is simply aware, the part that can watch thoughts, watch emotions, and sense meaning beyond the daily noise. Because once you lose contact with that deeper awareness, you don't need anyone to lock you in. You lock yourself in by living on autopilot, and the veil shows up in ordinary life in a few predictable ways. One way is constant distraction, the habit of always needing input, always needing stimulation, always needing something playing in the background, because silence makes the deeper self visible, and visibility is exactly what distraction prevents. Since the moment you sit still, you start noticing what you've been avoiding, like grief, fear, emptiness, or the simple question of what you're doing with your life. Another way is emotional reactivity, because when you're reactive, you are not remembering, you are responding, and response mode is like living inside a narrow tunnel where only one thing matters at a time. So anger, shame, jealousy, and panic become powerful not because they have the ability to see the wider picture. Another way is social identity, the pressure to be someone, to fit a role, to be seen as successful, spiritual, attractive, correct. And once you get trapped in That performance, your memory reorganizes around it, since you start remembering what supports the role and forgetting what threatens it. And over time, the soul feels far away because the stage, so bright you can see anything. Beyond the stage, another way is fear-based. Authority, when you accept someone else's. Certainty, as a substitute for your own inner clarity, because fear makes you outsource your mind. And once you outsource your mind, you also outsource your remembering. Since the soul doesn't remember through obedience, it remembers through recognition. And the last way, which ties it all together, is urgency, the feeling that everything must be solved right now, because urgency is like a spell that compresses your awareness into a single point, and the smaller your awareness becomes, the easier it is to guide, because a person who feels rushed will take almost any path that promises relief. So the veil, in practice, is the collection of habits and pressures that keep you living as if your deepest identity is your worries, your roles, and your reactions. And once you believe that, you forget not only before birth, you forget yourself moment to moment. Oh, here's the key twist in these traditions. Remembering is not mainly about recovering a hidden movie of past events. It's about waking up inside your present life, because the present is the only place where the veil can be seen. And once it's seen, it begins to thin. That naturally leads the next question: if the veil is maintained by distraction, reactivity, identity, and urgency, then what actually weakens it? What does remembering look like in a way that's real, grounded, and doable, without pretending you need to become a monk or believe in something extreme? What weakens the veil, in the simplest and most realistic sense, is not forcing yourself to remember a past life movie, and it's not hunting for supernatural signs, because the veil isn't only hiding a timeline, it's hiding your contact with awareness itself, and that contact returns through a few quiet moves that you can actually practice inside normal life. The first move is learning to create a small gap between stimulus and response, because the veil thickens every time you react automatically, and it thins every time you notice the reaction before it controls you. So, if you want something practical, start here. When you feel an emotional surge, especially fear, shame, or anger, name it gently in your mind, like fear is here, because naming doesn't solve the emotion, but it stops you from becoming the emotion, and that is the beginning of remembering. The second move is reducing input on purpose, not because the world is evil, but because constant input keeps you in a surface layer. So even 10 minutes a day of real quiet, no phone, no background noise, no scrolling, can feel like opening a window in a room that has been sealed for years. And what you're doing in that quiet isn't chasing answers. You're simply training your attention to stop running away from itself. Third move is learning to recognize the contracts you sign with life, because a lot of forgetting is agreement. Agreement to live only for approval. Agreement to be driven by urgency. Agreement to measure your worth by comparisons. Agreement to obey fear as if fear were a guide. And the moment you can see these agreements, you can stop renewing them, not with drama, but with a simple inner refusal to be rushed. Fifth Mavi is restoring contact with your body in a clean way, because the body is where the veil feels strongest, yet the body is also where you can anchor awareness, since breath, sensation, and presence pull you out of mental stories. And you don't need an exotic technique for this. You just need this a few times. Are breathing that you are here, And that thoughts are moving like weather rather than commanding like kings. The fifth move is the hardest one because it touches the real reason people stay asleep, and that is emotional avoidance. Since many people keep the veil thick because they don't want to feel grief, loneliness, regret, or uncertainty. Yet the strange truth is that when you finally let yourself feel what you've been avoiding with honesty and without self-hate, the veil begins to thin because you stop needing distraction as a shield. So remembering, in this sense, is not a fireworks moment. It's a slow shift where your life becomes less driven by the system's favorite tools, urgency, fear, shame, and performance, and more driven by clarity, presence, and a quieter kind of courage. And this is where the Gnostic idea becomes surprisingly compassionate, because it doesn't blame you for forgetting. It treats forgetting as the default condition of being here. And the invitation is not to feel guilty. It's to wake up gently one moment at a time until the spark inside you feels less like a distant rumor and more like the most obvious thing you've ever overlooked. Now, we're ready for a key question that many people wonder about silently. If remembering is possible, why doesn't it happen naturally for everyone? And what keeps pulling people back into forgetting even after they have moments of clarity? Even when people have real moments of clarity, the reason remembering doesn't happen automatically for everyone is that the world is built to reward forgetting, not in a cartoon villain way, but in a very human, very practical way. Because a person who is awake is harder to sell to, harder to scare, harder to shame into obedience, and harder to trap in endless comparison, while a person who is half asleep becomes predictable, and predictability is what systems love. So the first force that pulls people back into forgetting is pain avoidance, because remembering isn't only beautiful, it can also be confronting. Since the moment you become more present, you start noticing what you've been running from, like grief you never processed, anger you swallowed, loneliness you covered with noise, and regrets you buried under being busy. And most people don't go back to sleep because they are weak. They go back to sleep because being awake can hurt at first. Now, second fourth is because even if you awaken inwardly, you still live among people, and people often reinforce the mask, not because they're evil, but because the mask is what they recognize. And when you change, you can quietly threaten the balance of relationships, since your old role might have made others feel safe, and stepping out of it can bring friction. So the mind chooses belonging over truth without even noticing it made a choice. The third force is identity, addiction, because identity gives you a sense of control, since it tells you who you are, what you're allowed to feel, and what you're supposed to chase. And letting identity loosen can feel like stepping into open space with no railing, which is why people often trade freedom for certainty, because certainty feels like a solid floor, even when it's a cage. The fourth force is reward loops, because modern life is full of small hits of approval, success, and stimulation, and each hit trains you to seek more, and seeking more keeps attention outward. And when attention stays outward, inner remembering fades like a dream after waking. So, even if you don't believe in archons as beings, you can see how the system operates like archons, as patterns, because it keeps you chasing and comparing until you forget the quiet center completely. And there's a fifth force that is especially relevant to this video: spiritual performance. Because some people taste clarity and then immediately turn it into an identity. I'm awakened, I'm chosen, I'm different, and that identity becomes the new mask, and the mask feels spiritual, which makes it even harder to drop, since it comes with pride and belonging, and the Gnostic warning here is simple. The moment you use awakening to become superior, you're back under the veil, just wearing a brighter costume. So, remembering doesn't happen naturally because forgetting is comfortable, rewarded, and socially reinforced, while remembering requires a kind of quiet courage, the courage to feel what you feel, to loosen your attachment to the mask, and to live without constant stimulation as a shield. This is why many traditions describe remembering as a path, not a switch, because the veil doesn't tear once and vanish forever. It thins and thickens, depending on how you live, depending on how often you return to awareness, and depending on how willing you are to stop signing contracts with fear, approval, and urgency. Now, we can move into the closing stretch by bringing this into a clear takeaway, what the soul's forgetting might actually be for, what kind of lesson or mechanism it creates, and how to live in a way that honors the mystery without turning it into superstition. If we step back and ask what the soul's forgetting might be for, the most balanced answer is that it can be two things at once, because in many mystical traditions, forgetting is both a mechanism that makes human life possible and a risk that can keep you trapped, depending on whether you ever learn to wake up inside it. On the simplest level, fretting creates a clean start, because if you arrived with full memory and full cosmic perspective, ordinary life might not feel real enough to shape you, since pain would feel temporary, desire would feel small, and identity would feel like a costume you could remove at any time, which means the emotional intensity that drives learning, love, courage, and even empathy might never fully ignite. So one way to see the veil is as the price of being immersed, like an actor entering a role so deeply that the role becomes believable, because only when the story feels real and only when choices feel weighty do they reveal something true about you. But the Gnostic lens adds a warning, because immersion can become captivity when you forget that you're immersed, since then you stop acting and start believing the costume is your skin. And once that happens, the world's pressures can steer you through fear, guilt, pride, craving, and constant comparison, and you'll call it normal life, even as your deeper awareness quietly starves. So forgetting can create the conditions for growth, yet it can also create the conditions for manipulation. And the dividing line is awareness, because awareness is what lets you participate in life without being swallowed by it. That's why remembering in these traditions isn't mainly about collecting supernatural claims. It's about regaining orientation, like someone who has been lost in a forest and suddenly recognizes the stars, since the stars don't remove the forest, but they change how you move through it, because now you're not wandering on pure impulse. So how do you live in a way that honors the mystery without turning it into superstition? You live by treating everyday life as the place where the veil is either reinforced or thinned, meaning you watch the moments when you get rushed into reactions. You watch the moments when you trade honesty for approval. You watch the moments when you use distraction to avoid feeling, and instead of judging yourself, you practice returning again and again to the quiet witness inside you that can notice what is happening without being owned by it. And here's the most important part. You don't need to prove the cosmic story to benefit from it, because even as symbolism, it teaches a powerful truth which is that forgetting is not only about what you can't recall, it's also about what you stop noticing, and if you can begin nudging even a little device, already thinner than it was yesterday. Now we're almost ready to close this video with a clean summary. But first there's one last question people often carry quietly. If the veil is real in any sense, why do some people have flashes of remembering, strange intuitions, deep deja vu, or moments of I've been here before? And how should we interpret those experiences without getting lost? Flashes of remembering, the sudden feeling of I've been here before, a strange familiarity with a place you've never visited, a deep intuition that arrives without a clear reason, or a dream that feels more like a memory than a fantasy, are experiences that many people report. And the mistake is usually to jump to one extreme, either treating it as absolute proof of past lives or treating it as meaningless brain noise, because both extremes shut down the most useful question, which is what the experience does to your awareness. On the grounded side, psychology and the brain can explain a lot because the mind is a pattern machine and it can produce familiarity through small similarities, through emotional echoes, through forgotten details your conscious mind didn't register, and even through stress, because stress can blur the line between imagination and memory in subtle ways. So it's wise to stay humble and not build a whole cosmic religion around a single sensation. At the same time, mystical traditions would say that these flashes happen because the veil is not a solid wall. It's a shifting condition, and it thins in certain moments, especially when the mind is quiet, when the heart is open, when life is intense, or when you're close to the edges of identity, like during grief, deep love, near death, experiences, meditation, or major transitions. Because those are the moments when the usual mask loosens and something deeper can leak through. So, a balanced way to interpret these experiences is to treat them as signals, not certificates, meaning they might be hints that your awareness is wider than your everyday story, yet they are not automatic proof of a specific narrative. And the reason this approach is powerful is that it keeps you curious without making you gullible. If you've ever had déjà vu, notice how it behaves, because it often arrives with a strange double feeling, like this is familiar and I can't explain why. And that double feeling is important because it shows that the mind can sense a pattern before it can name it, and in mystical language, that can be described as the soul recognizing a shape that the personality can't translate into words. Now, here's the key: whether these flashes come from the brain, from the subconscious, or from something deeper, they only become useful when they lead you toward clarity, not obsession, because the veil can also use mystery as a distraction, making you chase signs, chase specialness, chase a dramatic story about yourself. And when that happens, the flash that could have awakened you turns into a new identity, costume, which pulls you right back into forgetting. So, if you want a practical way to relate to these moments, try this. When a flash happens, don't rush to label it, don't rush to share it for approval, and don't rush to build a life story around it. Instead, pause and ask, did this moment make me more present, more honest, and more aware of the deeper part of me? Because if it did, then it served remembering, and if it only made you hungry for more stimulation, then it served the veil. And this leads perfectly into the final close, because now we can tie the whole question together: why the soul forgets at birth, what the veil might be across the brain, the psyche, and the mystical map, and what the simplest form of remembering looks like that. Anyone can start practicing without turning life into superstition or turning spirituality into entertainment. So here's the full answer. In a way, you can remember without needing any complicated mythology. The soul forgets at birth because becoming human pulls awareness into a narrower form, and that narrowing happens on 3 levels at once: the brain level, the identity level, and what mystical traditions call the veil, the set of pressures that keeps attention locked on survival, emotion, and roles. On the brain level, memory is still developing, language is still forming, and early experience is stored more like raw feeling than like a tidy story, which is why even your first years are mostly missing from your timeline, not because they didn't matter, but because the system that turns experience into biography wasn't fully built yet. On the psychological level, the mind builds a workable identity by filtering life through safety and belonging, because to function, here you need a me that can play the game, and once that me forms, it starts editing what you notice and what you remember, pushing deeper awareness into the background so you can operate in a world that rewards focus, performance, and predictability. And on the mystical level, the veil is the name for the way this world keeps the narrowing reinforced through distraction, reactivity, urgency, fear, guilt, and identity. Addiction, because a soul that is always reacting has no space to remember, and a soul that never remembers is easier to steer, whether you see that as cosmic forces, social systems, or simply patterns of human control. So the most important shift is this: remembering is not mainly about forcing hidden memories to return. It's about regaining contact with the quiet awareness beneath your autobiography, the part of you that can watch thoughts, watch emotions, and notice the difference between pressure and truth, because that contact is what thins the veil in real time. That means the simplest form of remembering is not dramatic, it's practical, and it looks like this. You pause before reacting, you name what you feel. Instead of becoming it, you reduce noise long enough to hear yourself, and you stop signing emotional contracts made under fear, shame, or urgency, because every time you do that, you are proving something directly to yourself, which is that you are more than the mask the world trained you to wear. And if you've had flashes, déjà vu, deep intuitions, or strange familiarity, you don't have to turn them into a religion or dismiss them as nothing. You can treat them as signals that your awareness is wider than your daily story, while still staying humble enough to not build your identity around being special, because the fastest way to fall asleep again is to turn remembering into a costume. So here's the question I want to leave you with, and it's meant to be a compass, not a scare, in your daily life. What pulls you back into forgetting most often? Distraction, or far may need it to be approved? And what would happen if you started treating one small pause each day as a way of remembering who you are beneath all that noise? And if you want more videos that build these maps calmly, without hype and without fear selling, then it really does help to subscribe to the channel, because this topic only becomes truly useful when you connect it to the bigger picture over time, and I'd rather build that picture with you than leave you alone with fragments